name is John Kraus, and today we're asking, what if all public buildings had to maintain social distancing for years? Over the next hour, we'll be looking at how a sustained period of pandemic measures might affect commercial real estate that is still in the delivery pipeline. How long can we continue with short-term pandemic measures in existing commercial real estate assets? Is there a role for architectural psychology, whatever that may be? And if you're an investor or if you manage an estate, we'll be asking our experts how a sustained period of pandemic measures might affect commercial real estate property portfolio strategies. Let's meet our experts. Firstly, based in Luxembourg, is Jarek Morawski, Executive Director, Strategy and Research Team at Grosvenor Europe. Welcome to you, Jarek.
Good afternoon.
Secondly, joining us today from Paris is Tina Payet, Chair of RICS Europe. Welcome to you, Tina.
Thank you, John.
And completing our panel, thank you. And completing our panel based in London is Jez Groom, founder, CEO, and Chief Choice Architect at Cowrie Consulting. Hello to you, Jez.
Hey, John, great to be here.
Thank you. We have participants joining us today from around 30 countries, and we always welcome your active involvement. So do please let us have your questions throughout the session. We'll put them to our experts as we go along. And if you're new to the webinars, you should see that you're able to submit questions via a box on your screen. So let's make a start. Our first topic is new assets. And if we start by looking at the early stages of the property life cycle, at assets that have yet to come to the market, Jarek, if I can turn to you first, how might a sustained period of pandemic measures affect commercial real estate that is still in the delivery pipeline?
Thank you, John. So I think in the first place, we can probably assume that the market won't really know that it will be a sustained period right away. So we'll be having a period just like today with first an assumption that this is a temporary situation, which I honestly still think is the most realistic one. And then as the situation continues, we'll probably, the markets and everyone involved will gradually realize that that might be a longer term situation. So still hoping for the best. I suppose that the impact on individual decisions on the developer side, on the investors, will certainly depend on the stage of the development you're in. So for those in later stages, short before delivery, fitting out and really just waiting for the occupiers, that there's probably relatively little you can do beyond what has been done now, which might very well be sufficient even in the long term in many cases. So we're talking about choosing the right fit out, introducing layouts or modifying layouts that are a bit more in line with health measures, with social distancing and similar. So there's I suppose there's quite a bit of talk about something like a 6 feet office where you try to maintain a certain distance between occupiers. And then there's probably things like filters in your aircon, various temperature monitors, so these technical measures. Well, if you're in a later stage, in an earlier stage, there might be a few more options. So that might be a bit more strategic decision than saying in the first place, are you developing the right product for this new reality, for this new market? This kind of very densely occupied offices were I suppose until COVID, the COVID-19 crisis emerged, it was a measure of efficiency of offices, how many people you can put in per square foot or per square meter in a space. Not sure this measure would really mean anything going forward. So that kind of density focus might change. So you might reconsider how you design your assets. You might think of the users as such as developing micro apartments the right choice, or maybe bigger units might work better. So this kind of design questions will certainly be asked with most developers, and are being asked now for the case it really happens. But having said this, my view is that a lot of these trends are not really new, because when you think what it means, when we think about more remote work, more flexibility, especially with respect to the office sector, that's not necessarily a trend that emerged during the current crisis or during the lockdown. It has been with us for quite a while, and same with e-commerce. That's online sales were increasing before in the previous years as well. So in that sense, COVID-19 probably accelerated a lot of these trends, but not necessarily introduced a lot of very new ones. Maybe a new one would be a stronger focus on health in the workplace, on generally public spaces. So in that sense, if you if you are developing offices, then probably thinking long term, you probably already noticed the trends towards more flexibility, more ad hoc space, probably a trend towards an office becoming more of an interaction space, space where people meet and communicate, rather than just a floor with a lot of desks. And there was an increase in remote working in the previous years as well. So that has been going on for years. So looking forward and extending these trends, if that was the product you were working on before the crisis and you're working on currently, that might mean that you should be fine in the post-COVID reality, even if we need to introduce these measures.
Thank you, Yaron. So, there's some good insights there. I should just let you know your sound is a little bit shaky, so it may be you just want to check your microphone. Let me bring in Tina at this point. Tina, from what you're hearing from Jarek, is that the picture that you would see from your experience in the European market?
I find what Jarek just said extremely reassuring. And I think my viewpoint from what I'm seeing is that while in Europe, perhaps the reactivity on the impacts this will have is perhaps a bit slower than, say, what we're seeing in North America, or what we're seeing in the UK. I do think that as the sort of information on the pandemic and its route of travel, I think the European market is going to be extremely under pressure to make these changes. Things that we took for granted before are now becoming really worries and concerns. And two of the sort of major ones that are very costly to retrofit and very costly even if you want to design them in is air quality on the one hand and lifting on the other hand. So I think that those two topics, and for those listening from North America, I'm talking about elevators when I talk about lifts. Those are real issues for the post-pandemic building. I think air quality, I don't think we will go back to people feeling comfortable going into a building, whether that be a leisure building, restaurant, or hotel, or cinema, or going back into an office. a shopping mall and feeling comfortable without knowing that their health is being protected and looked after, meaning that the air quality is demonstrably healthy and clean. This is the sort of thing that I think is going to be a real change.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because I mean, how do you know that that building is as clean and, if you like, COVID safe as it might claim? I mean, is the real estate sector going to be bringing in some sort of certifications that say that this building is pandemic safe? Is there a move towards that?
So John, you know, that's a great question. And I have to say that I've seen a few, I think the shopping centers were the first to go down this route. I have seen major shopping center REITs bringing on board the likes of Bureau Veritas or other certification sort of engineering firms that can attest to the hotel business as well. I think Accor Hotels likewise brought in a third party to attest to and to basically build the protocols that they thought would be necessary and reassuring as far as air, cleanliness of surfaces, you know, even going as far as of specifying free touchless access to a certain number of things. These are all important points that I think are, you know, the hotel industry and the shopping center industry have been the first to be on that bandwagon. But I do think that other buildings and notably offices will follow suit. I think people will choose. They now know, companies know, and the employees know that they can work from home or work remotely. And so the choice is up to them. Do they want to go into the office? What is the risk they're taking to go in? How can they be certain that they're not putting themselves at risk?
Thank you. Let me ask Jez for some views here. From your point of view, Jez, and we'll talk about the psychology side of it later on in the conversation, but from what you hear in the market, you know, Tina was talking about the choice there, people having the choice to work from home or go into the office. How are you, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge in decision making sometimes is ambiguity. So our brains don't like to make decisions with unforeseen sort of circumstances. So, you know, the conversation around some form of accreditation, whether we need to go that far, I'm not sure, but I certainly think, you know, office buildings, I mean, I'm in a WeWork building in London now, and the protocols and the compliance sort of information they've sent out around things like air quality and air conditioning is, you know, fills me with the kind of the reassurance that I need to come back into the workplace. So I think, yeah, ambiguity isn't great for the brain, and as much certainty and reassurance about what has been done is really important. So I wholeheartedly sort of agree with Tina on that. And again, you know, Tina makes a great point around air. And I'll talk a little bit about it later. But there have been, you know, some early psychological studies and frameworks that look about how a building can, I suppose, be improved to improve sort of the well-being and psychological state of the people that are in that environment. And air is a critical sort of part of that. So we know that we're affected by airflow, the temperature of that air, what the source of that air is, and also how the air smells. And this can affect, you know, what our interpretation and what our behaviour might be sort of as a result. And there's about 6 other factors which I can cover later, but, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with the panelists so far.
Thank you. I like the idea of being able to use the air in the building as an excuse for my behaviours. So it's quite an interesting idea.
Well, yeah, it's often a topic of conversation would be the temperature, you know. So, you know, I think we've all experienced a hot room, and it's not a comfortable environment, and neither is a cold one. And to get that balance right in a meeting is quite tricky. I found when I pitched to clients, it's really quite difficult to get the room temperature right, because it's usually too cold to start, but then the room warms up with the people in it and the conversation. So it's quite a tricky balance psychologically to get, I don't know, clients into a good friendly state such that they're welcome to your ideas. But yeah, it's something that we have thought about.
That's interesting. So I think this is a good lead into the second topic, which is you know, having spoken a bit about pipeline assets, what about existing assets? Because the CRE assets already in use are adapting to the pandemic with short-term temporary measures, so removable screens, for example, or the one-way direction of travel through existing staircases and so on, or maybe closing down communal points such as T points and that kind of thing. But you know, that may not be the long-term solution. So Tina, if I can turn to you on this one, how sustainable are the short-term pandemic measures that are being put in place in existing commercial real estate assets?
So, John, before I answer your question, I just want to take a step back for a minute or two and look at what sustained pandemic measures actually means, because my answer will be in that context. So if we are looking at sustained pandemic measures for 5 years, which is the title of the conference, it means that people will be doing remote working, probably in part at least, for much longer than was initially planned. Right now, I think we're going on for most markets about 6 months of remote working. And a lot of habits are made in 6 months' time. And while part of the workforce is back in a number of our markets across Europe, and I understand the same in the other regions of the world, it is far from being fully returned, and we know that this could last a certain time. So the longer this goes on, the more habit-inducing it is, the more technology comes into play to facilitate this sort of remote working, and the more hesitant, and even frankly, the more questioning there will be from both employers and employees on what purpose the office serves and how often one needs to be there. And this is where I totally join up with Jarek, what he was saying earlier about, you know, certainly offices will need to be a place where you go for creating, for meeting up, for doing other things, not just, I think Jarek said, not just desks in a row, which I totally subscribe to. So that's the first point. And the second one is, how about the economic impact of this pandemic? There are, and already showing, and will probably be more collateral effects of these lockdowns and of these pandemic measures. And this means that certain businesses, there will be a downturn in general, but certain industries in particular will be very hard hit. And this is going to change the way people consume real estate and use real estate. So again, if international travel is down for a extended period of time, what does that mean for the hotel and leisure industry? You know, if retail trends continue to go very strongly in the direction of online retail, what does that mean for the retail real estate industry? And same for offices, as we were just talking about. So I think there's going to be a real questioning about the actual model of the real estate, how it's used, what its purpose is. And that's going to change immensely what these measures today are being used for. So now back to your question, how about these short-term measures, like you were saying, you know, one-way traffic, closing down the T-points, spacing people out, using meeting rooms as offices. For me, these are really stopgap measures. I think in the longer term, and as things continue, there will need to be more ingrained measures that are part and parcel of what I call the design, sustainability, and technology of the workplace or of the shopping center or of the hotel, and they need to be ingrained in that. Otherwise, they're flimsy and they're not going to reassure. So I think this is where, and I'm going to try to wrap up because I want to be too long so we can get into more questions. I think this is where technology and PropTech is going to step up in order to manage, to communicate. I think what Jez was saying, he works in a sort of shared, you know, workspace as a service office in London, if I understood correctly. And, you know, he is given regular information on the protocols and the compliance of, you know, the air quality and the cleanliness of the space that he works in, and that's reassuring. This is the sort of thing, these apps, you know, that can be tenant portals or, you know, tenant experience apps, these sort of apps where the communication, the protocols can be not only identified and communicated, but they can also do things like show you a hot map of the building and tell you where the areas are where you can set into an office and have the sort of space that you need to work on the sort of work you're doing that day. Or, you know, this, you know, to tell you what times of day is best to come by and this store or the other store. You know, all this technology is going to help facilitate these different uses that are going to be coming out of the changes from this long pandemic measure, if, as we're suggesting here, they last for 5 years.
Thank you. And you mentioned protocols there, Tina, and one of our listeners, John Lager, has asked the question about the UK government policy, but I think it could apply to any country. The question really is, you know, to what extent are governments giving people advice on returning to work based on sound and reliable protocols for returning to those, whether it's work or whether it's hotels and leisure facilities. So I suppose the question really is where are governments getting their advice on whether commercial real estate assets are safe for people to return to? What's the source of the advice and the protocols?
Is that question for me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think it's very different according to countries, and I definitely don't have a view on every country, but I've been looking closely at the protocols in the UK. I have some information about the protocols in the US, and I obviously live right up front and close to, you know, the European protocols, and namely the protocols in France. And I see a very different approach. I see the UK basing it on, I may be getting this wrong, but basing it on a number of sort of scientific requirements. Okay, I see the US actually going to sort of engineering associations that are, you know, providing the sort of pandemic air quality measurements and things like that. And then I see in Europe a more spatial and protective sort of modus operandi, meaning, for instance, in France, you have to have 4 square meters per person so that you can be, you know, safe in your space, and you can't occupy, whether it be a shop or an office, you know, closer than 4 square meters. And more recently, you have to wear a mask even inside, you know, inside all shops, inside all offices. So this is, it's a different approach. I don't know if that answered the question.
Thank you. It does answer the question very well. Perhaps I can bring Jarek back into the conversation now. Jarek, what's your take on, firstly, this idea of where the protocols are coming from and how they should be set, but also on the sustainability of the stopgap measures as Tina described them?
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me now. Can you confirm?
That's better. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yeah, I think in the first place, I fully agree with Tina. It's, you know, the protocols are well, they are not necessarily driven by real estate, right? So we see these measures that are maybe to some extent ad hoc because the situation arose so suddenly and no one was really expecting it to well, this pandemic to well, proceed so quickly and so widely across the world. So I'm probably not really thinking about protocols, and especially if we're thinking about these short-term measures staying for longer, then I suppose that's not really a solution, sort of wearing masks forever. So I would expect that you know, these short-term measures would need to evolve to something else, something more fundamental. What that will be, we'll certainly see. But the trend towards a healthy building has been there before. I'm sort of repeating what I mentioned earlier. So I don't think this is fundamentally new. The new aspect is maybe a stronger focus on infection protection and these areas. But things like clean air, what Jess mentioned earlier, was a big topic also for us, for Grosvenor, before the pandemic. So that there's a lot of initiatives around that, and these will need to move to you know, these measures would need to move to a stage where they are implemented and embedded in buildings rather than taken ad hoc as protocols. And having said this, I'm you know, as important as it is to behave appropriately and keep the distance in the current situation, I suppose in the long term we need to be mindful that you know, human nature is social, and interacting with other humans is just part of our DNA. So it's hard to imagine that you know, suddenly disappearing. So we'll need to find ways to cope with it. And I frankly, I don't have an answer in the long term. I'm not quite sure many people have an answer here in this area. So we'll need to probably look towards the tech industry, like Tina mentioned, to and also engineering and you know, guys who deal with it every day, to find solutions that are workable in the long term. I'm not at all sure that the short-term current existing measures can be really long-term.
Thank you. And to everyone listening, do submit questions, your reactions to what you've heard so far about the measures that have been taken and how sustainable they are, and what new measures might need to be brought in on a longer term basis. But for now, I want to take the conversation in a different direction, and looking at the psychology of buildings. Architectural psychology is a field concerned with the impact of design choices on physical and emotional well-being. It's an area that real estate professionals may not have had quite as much experience as they have of other areas of dealing with the industry. So Jez, can you help us on this one? What is architectural psychology and how might it be incorporated into thinking around workplace pandemic measures in the future?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, John. And yeah, I think in terms of the area, I think psychology has gone through kind of a slight reframing. So I think some of the listeners and participants have been more familiar with more, I suppose, trendier titles like behavioral economics or behavioral science, which is rooted in psychology. It's kind of a reframing. And I've got a team of psychologists and behavioral economists, and some of the work we do focuses on customer experience. So that points to some of the locations that Tina was talking about, which might be more retail focused. But then also as well, we've got employee experience that we look at to see how we might improve that, such that it does improve the customer experience. And our experiences are taking academic studies that empirically evidence and are often sort of cited and peer reviewed and challenged to start to test these academic sort of learnings in the real world. And it's fascinating. So there's no doubt that we know that the architectural sort of environment, either the outside or the inside of buildings, can fundamentally affect how we feel and how we behave. And there's a growing field of architectural psychology that's looking at that, as well as, I suppose, what makes a building beautiful and why it makes it so appealing, kind of an evolutionary psychological perspective. But I just want to focus more, I suppose, on maybe sort of the built environment more, kind of, I think that Tina mentioned fit out. I think one of the things that we do is that some of the listeners may or may not be familiar, but the LSE, so London School of Economics, their behavioural science sort of professor, Paul Dolan, with one of his PhD students, they actually looked at kind of a meta-analysis of all the different factors that might affect sort of psychology and well-being of people in buildings. And they've come up with a checklist, if you like, a simple mnemonic, and I sort of referenced it earlier. But it's called salient. Is essentially the first letter of each theme, and I'll just quickly run through the themes because they are fascinating. So the first one, and quite a lot of these are quite obvious actually. So the first one is sound, so that's the S. That if we're often working in a noisy environment, our attention can be drawn to kind of unpredictable and attention-seeking sounds and distract us. So that doesn't make for a good work or leisure environment. Air, we've already covered, flow, temperature, source, and scent. But also light. So depending on what experience we're trying to create, our behaviour can be, I suppose, driven positively or negatively by too much light or maybe not enough light. Image. So we are stimulated by certain imagery and affected by clutter. And I think that's a real opportunity for I suppose people within the design of spaces is to think about what are the constraints that we're now under, but how can we turn those constraints into something that's a real positive and utilize the increased space to decrease clutter and improve people's well-being. Ergonomics, we don't adapt well to poorly designed furniture and equipment, so those rows of desks that we talked about a little bit earlier. And then nature, we are affected in largely positive ways by exposure to natural elements. And then finally tint, so our behaviour is affected by the presence of different colours. And we followed this checklist. So we did some work. It was actually with a fit out business, but it was actually working on the construction workers. And it was in the Shell building on the South Bank that was under construction. And we looked through kind of some of the problems. It was around unsafe behaviour, low level unsafe behaviours that can sometimes escalate. And we looked at some of these factors. One of them was image. So we looked at the health and safety messages that were particularly around the space in which they're relaxed, and we took away all of the health and safety messages to declutter and then made it very, very salient, the key messages. We added nature, so on the 28th floor of the building site we added lots of plants, cleared out more space for natural light to come in. And then the final thing we did is we actually painted the walls of this canteen pink. What's interesting about this particular sort of shade and Pantone reference of pink is it was kind of celebrated in the 80s and the 90s as Baker Miller pink or drunk tank pink, which has this effect of, I suppose, calming us down. But actually it allows us to produce oxytocin and reduce testosterone, which allows us to have a lower appetite for risk and to be more relaxed and more caring. So that's kind of like the factors that exist within the academic world, but I think they've been largely unexplored within the built environment. And I think there's a massive opportunity. And I really do agree with Jarek and Tina so far, as to say that the way that businesses and organizations are responding to in the short term is definitely compliant. It's definitely safe and reassuring, but there's a real opportunity to essentially redesign environments now to improve the psychology and well-being of those people that are using those environments, and paying specific attention to these factors. Often they can be quite low-cost solutions, taking things away rather than adding things, that can make quite transformational sort of differences to how people sort of feel. And then the final thing, which is fascinating, again, maybe this is a step too far. Tina was mentioning kind of like how you might measure how people are feeling. But within the psychological field, we often try to go to biometrics. So rather than asking people how they feel, sometimes people give you the answer they think they should say, rather than what they really feel. So there are some studies that exist that looked at things like measuring galvanic skin response. So that's looking at sweat levels. So you might be taking people into an environment and seeing how aroused they might be, positive or negatively, and you get a true representation of how they're feeling. And even EEG, so actually listening to brain waves to try and understand again whether it's a good or a bad feeling. So you know, there's a wealth of knowledge there. I just don't feel like it's being tapped into at this critical time, and I would say this is a fantastic opportunity to redesign these environments with these principles in mind.
So I think lots of people listening will be able to identify with that. You can imagine, you know, perhaps if you're in an office which is painted, you know, in some very aggressive bright red color, that might affect the way you feel in comparison to perhaps a more calming color. You know, you can imagine that people would like to be in an environment where the light levels are appropriate. But what I didn't really understand from the aspects of salient was, you know, if I'm asking the question, I want to feel safe from a pandemic, what are these salient points? Which of those is going to help address the pandemic safety
Yeah,
feeling?
I think yeah, it's a really good point. I think they all combine in different ways. And for me, I think imagery. So I think Jarek was talking about essentially people might start to feel socially isolated. You know, sometimes you look at imagery that's used in spaces, and it's nice to look at in maybe an abstract form, but no one's really thought about what behavior we're trying to induce. And we know that, and studies have been shown in sort of architecture, that our brains are highly devoted to understanding faces and facial expressions. And one thing that I suppose give that feeling of sense of socialness, but also positive socialness, would be to have pictures of people in and around the environment that look like they're in a safe environment, looks reassuring, and some of them would be smiling. And we know that starts to fire some of the mirror neurons in our own brain and starts to confer that sort of sense of I'm with people, it's in a safe environment, and I feel reassured because they're smiling. They can't be madly smiling, you know, so there's obviously work done in facial recognition to try and understand kind of to what extent that could be and what a real smile could be. But those are kind of some very simple things that at a very low cost level can start to help give that feeling of connection with people, and I suppose, yeah, the safety and reassurance that they need.
Thank you. Let me just remind everyone listening that there's still opportunities for questions, so do let us have some if you wish to ask any questions. Perhaps I could just bring Jarek in again just to respond to some of what Jez was saying. I mean, Jarek, you know, from your research, from Grosvenor's work, to what extent are you hearing of clients, developers, investors, occupiers asking or talking about the kind of aspects of the salient aspects that Jez was describing for us?
Yes, I think that is an increasingly important factor, and you see this. I mean, as an example, you can see certifications of based on health aspects increasing in the office sector, like the WELL well building certificates, and that they focus more and more on things like clean air, clean water, good fit outs. So giving users a reassurance that the place is safe, and it's, frankly, I mean, in very simple terms, is a nice place to spend the day. And that was the case before the pandemic. I guess now the health aspects come on top of it, and the whole thing of feeling well in the space becomes even more important. And we've seen that we can, many of us can work remotely, and many of us don't necessarily enjoy it, at least not all the time. So bringing in this aspect is quite important in terms of probably not just physical but also your mental health, and that is something that we've seen. I would expect this aspect to gain even more traction with especially with occupiers. When you bring in people to the office, you want them to feel safe, and you want them to feel well, and all this comes together. I mean, I can't talk about the details like Jez does, in terms of what color of the walls is the right one, but certainly having plans helps, and that's not necessarily a new recognition. And you can certainly help with help counter the drain from social distancing by applying these measures. So I fully agree. I do think that these aspects will be more and more important going forward.
Thank you, Jarek. Tina, perhaps you can comment. I mean, perhaps from a point of view of a professional body, you're working with professional members of RICS in particular across the European market and beyond. To what extent are members of the real estate professions starting to look at aspects such as architectural psychology?
I think that it is immensely important right now. I think that although I have just learned from Jez the acronym SALIENT, I love it. It's exactly, I think, the sort of ideas that need to be pushed and need to be progressed. And I think, as Jarek was saying, it's not new. For instance, there are certifications for wellness in buildings, the WELL certification, or so these things have existed for a number of years, but I think are only coming more and more to the forefront. And I'd like to add into salient, maybe we'll make it salience with an S at the end. I'd like to add in sustainability. I think that people feel better when they know that the buildings that they are occupying, that they are spending time in, are also buildings that are respectful of the environment, whether that be from a use of materials, being eco-materials, which obviously impact quite a bit the interiors, but also has this building been designed with the circular economy in mind? Is this building healthy to the environment in such a way that energy usage and CO2 emissions are being carefully tracked and reduced as much as possible? I think this is all key, and I think it goes together. It's and I'm going to put in a little plug here for a 5-piece article that I 5-part article that that was published on the World Built Environment Forum just these last few weeks, and it's called Tomorrow's Workplace Today. So I invite those on the call, if they're interested, to find out a bit more. Take a look at it. And in that, I do talk about designing healthy and sustainable buildings for a productive workforce, and designing for sustainability, wellness, and beyond. And this, for me, is key. I think what Jez was saying, and I love the acronym Salient, I think it's right spot on.
And I mean, looking at the UK in particular at the moment, but not just in the UK, there's a huge debate about the safety of buildings. You mentioned materials, Tina, and whether they're sound materials that are economic, ecologically well sourced and all the rest of it. But looking at fire safety and this whole issue of cladding, people really do want assurance that the materials that have been used meet the safety standards and they've been fitted correctly. So that there are other aspects to this as well, I think one could bring into the conversation. But let's move on to our last theme today, which is around the portfolio strategies, and actually reflects a question that one of our listeners is putting to us online. Mark Thompson is saying that if we assume that we now expect a large amount of city centre office space to become vacant or leases not to be renewed, then what does this mean in terms of the future alternative uses for these spaces? And I think Mark's question is actually very much what our last topic is, which is when we look beyond the individual asset level, what might a sustained period of pandemic measures mean for property portfolio strategies? So whether it's corporate headquartering, logistics, and so on. I wonder what we might see there. Perhaps I can ask Jarek to come in first on that one.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose this is one of the big questions that most people in strategy and real estate are asking today. What is the real estate of the future? And from my perspective, it seems like a lot of trends that we were projecting for the next 10 or 20 years suddenly happened over 3 months. That's how it feels. You just like you just rushed on. And for strategies, it will certainly have implications, although we can't be yet sure how deep. I don't quite agree with the view that cities and CBDs will become vacant. There's two trends at work here. One is remote work, and the other one is changing nature of offices. So office becoming a meeting space rather than a working space. And to have a really good, efficient meeting, you still need to have space. You can't be just squashed in a tiny room. I suppose all of us had this experience. So in that sense, I do see demand for offices. It's just possibly different type of offices. But I wouldn't necessarily predict a major hike in vacancy here, possibly short term, but we tend to confuse probably cyclical effects with trends, and cyclically we are in a recession, and this recession will take a toll on real estate that will most likely lead to some vacancy across the sector, but structurally I don't see this as a necessary development. It's more the type of offices that we need that will change, and that is something that we'll need to include in our strategies. We'll need to think, what kind of buildings do we build? What kind of buildings do we want to have in a portfolio, and which buildings will be demanded. That's taking this, in the perspective of the COVID experience. It's probably the buildings that are still quite easy to reach, although don't necessarily need to be very central. You can go a bit off the prime pitch, but at the same time, buildings that allow for really efficient cooperation. And what do you need for this is probably space. You need floor space plates to achieve this space, to achieve flexibility.
I'm just wondering, Jarek, just building on what you're talking about then, because people talk about a green premium or a brown discount for buildings that are perhaps not performing very well in terms of energy performance. Is it conceivable we would see a pandemic, a pandemic secure premium and a pandemic vulnerable discount for buildings? Is that the sort of way the market might start to go?
Yes, I suppose that is a possibility, although I would probably not call it this way. I would call it, a future-proof premium or discount, and that doesn't necessarily need to be related to the pandemic or health-related characteristics of buildings. To me, it's more being able to use the building in an possible future environment where working remotely is quite standard, but then still people need to meet, and they need to meet when they meet. They want to meet efficiently. So this would be more of a reason for a premium to me. And again, really repeating the same phrase, I don't think this is fundamentally different to the pre-COVID world. This is where we were forecasting the markets to be heading to, only in a bit longer perspective than maybe today. So that this future-proof buildings, that's more of a concept to me than pandemic-proof, or only pandemic-proof. And at the same time, part of it is being a sustainable building. So that definitely plays a big role. I think we can't, discard it. A future-proof building is one that, frankly, is probably net zero carbon and really friendly to the user and a healthy one.
Thank you. And just to note that if listeners are interested in reading the article that Tina was referring to, you can find a link to it at the top of our Twitter feed at the moment. I'd like to bring Tina back in then on this idea of portfolios, and just pick up a point made by Paul Hayes, who's listening. Paul says, do you think developers are going to be increasingly influenced by increased quality and environmental design to attract commercial tenants, and that this might require a rental premium in order to fund it? Absolutely on topic with this question of investor sentiment and strategies for portfolios. What would be your response to that, Tina?
I couldn't agree more with Paul. I think that is absolutely the way things are going. My only question and my only doubt would be whether or not, and maybe I actually know the answer to this one, but it's whether or not we're talking about a premium or whether this becomes the standard. You might recall probably, in most of our markets about 10 years ago, sustainability certifications were exceptional. There were some markets, I remember in Germany, for instance, practically nothing, no buildings, no office buildings, and much less retail or any other sector had any sustainable certification, because they just figured that, they had very strict building code and therefore no need for a sustainable certification. Well, that's changed. And today, if you build a new development and you do not have a sustainable certification, meaning some sort of proxy that says that your building has been built in a sustainable manner and should operate sustainably, you will have a hard time finding tenants. You will not be able to sell your building. Its value will be affected. So we're talking about, it's no longer a choice, it's a must-have. And I think we're going in that same direction. So my answer to Paul Hayes is yes, you're right. We're going in that same direction for what we're going to call the sustainable, healthy building, which I don't think that we can take a shortcut and have not do that on new developments, on a new build. Now, what will happen to the existing portfolios that may not be up to par? We may see ourselves going into a two-class sort of system where you have, the A class, and then you've got the rest of it. But I think that's where we're heading.
you. And we've just got a very short amount of time left, so I'm going to bring Jez in just for any final comments. Jez, listening to the whole of the discussion we've had so far, where is architectural psychology going to be able to have the most impact in the real estate sector from here on in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's looking holistically at the well-being of the user of the environments, and yeah, I struggle with some of the motivations of people that say, yeah, to Yarek's point, nobody's going to work in the city and work from home. You know, I just sort of sense those are either people that have got businesses that want to reduce their cost to serve, so there's a motivation for that, and they're not thinking about the people working in their buildings maybe as much as they should do. And then, you know, I think, again, just to build on Yarek and Tina's points, I think what we found is the pandemic has just accelerated so many different trends. And I don't believe so much in remote working. I believe in flexible working and giving people the choice. There are some types of activities where it's brilliant to be working remotely, potentially at home or a home office. And then there are other types of activities which is immensely more productive if you're working in an office environment. And I think giving people that choice and treating them as humans and allowing them to empower them to make that decision, I think is a real step forward. And I think that's to be embraced. It may be sitting on the fence, but I think we've had one extreme so far, which is essentially everyone works in these sort of manufacturing environments. And the other extreme, I think, is equally apocalyptic, in my view. You know, the loudest voices seem to be those people that have, you know, roles which tend to be remote roles, like so things that they like working by themselves and they can do it by themselves. But I think there's a lot of things that don't require that. And you know, there's some kind of like some really sort of, I think some real sort of hard edge stuff to it. You know, I've got a business where the average age is about 25, 26. And some of the guys, they live in London, they don't have a lot of space in their home environment. They love coming into a WeWork because it's big, it's spacious, and it has, you know, the coffee and all the accoutrements. It's a lovely place to work. And surely, you know, I think if we are going to move forward, we've got to talk to all of the different stakeholders and get a more balanced opinion, because I think at the moment it's being driven by people that love working from home remotely by themselves and people that are looking to reduce costs in their businesses. And actually, if we all took a step back and thought actually what's best for us as the humans and what can create a better place for us all to live and work, I think that should be the start point.
Thanks, Jez. And a lot of those points were made in some of our earlier webinars on COVID-related topics. You know, that it is more about flexible working than a straightforward black and white choice between the office and home working, and how do you balance all of that and get it right for everyone? Because we have a very diverse workforce now, and increasingly a widespread of ages working in the same office. So those needs need to be looked at in a, as you say, a holistic way and taking account of all the diversity. Well, that's all we've got time for today. So I do want to thank our experts, Yarek Moravsky, Executive Director, Strategy and Research Team at Grosvenor Europe, Tina Payet, Chair of RSS Europe, and Jez Groom, Founder, CEO and Chief Choice Architect at Cowrie Consulting. A reminder that we'll publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar online. Do please feel free to share those with your professional networks. Please also take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars and catch up on any that you may have missed. Also, we have a new podcast series. Please have a listen to that and let us know what you think. Give us your comments. Finally, we have an app which you can download from the App Store or from Google Play. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your questions and comments with us online. And until next time, goodbye.